My name is Kate Mozier-Tichy, and welcome to Episode 5 of Ridgefield and Fairfield County's Native Populations. This time we're going to talk about the French and Indian War, which was from 1755 to 1763. So this war, the French and Indian War, is a huge topic. So this will by no means be a comprehensive account of the war. I'm going to try and focus on how the conflict affected Connecticut, and in particular the American Indian residents in Fairfield County. So it wasn't fought on Connecticut land, but that doesn't mean it didn't have an impact. And it is also extremely important in talking about the lead up to the Revolutionary War, as you will see in the end. After King Philip's War, which we talked about in the last episode, episode 4, settler and native interactions continued on a daily basis. We do know that various groups and singular Indians continue to live in and around Ridgefield. In particular, a gentleman with the name of Chicken Morups. He, at the very least, lived in Reading, right next door. He sold the land, but there's also a story that he liked to sit on a rock on the shore of Great Pond, and this was then called Chicken's Rock. There were very few, though, left in Fairfield County, as far as we can tell, because King Philip's War seems to have really driven out the local populations, or at least killed most societies in Connecticut of Indians. They had either moved out or been decimated by war. So this is called the Algonquin diaspora. Many of the natives of Connecticut ended up in New York and Canada. Others that had tried to hide after King Philip's War ended up in slavery in the Caribbean. So, despite all this, native enlistment in the local militias was high between 1689 and 1726. And many of these tribal men served for political purposes, for the survival of the tribe, or to prove their masculinity lacking their traditional ways. Lo and behold, though, there were issues with the Indians that were left, and this had resulted in restrictions on the Indians and their activities starting in the 1720s. And this is because there was increasing encroachment on Indian lands, and thus increasing disagreements between them. It didn't help that since the late 17th century, hostilities between France and Great Britain and North America had been continuous. King William's War from 1689 to 1697 involved some natives that allied with France, but they did not attack British head-on. They involved guerrilla warfare tactics, or what we call today guerrilla warfare tactics. They had learned from King Philip's War that it was suicide to attack them head-on. Regardless, though, it did end up in a bounty. In 1694 actually was the first bounty on children in North America. And in 1702 to 1713, we have Queen Anne's War. And in Figure 1, we see what North America looked like at the end of this. The blue is France, the red and purple are Britain, and orange is Spain. In 1744, we have King George's War. This war actually is notably the first time that Native Americans are integrated into the militias with the settler troops, and this actually increased the rate of disease and death because they were in much more close contact. Though they had daily interactions, they weren't necessarily living together. In the military, thus they're fully integrated and living together, and we see a lot more transfer of disease, they believe. And this was brought back to so they believe these were brought back to their tribes, and these further decimated and caused more problems for the tribes. And New England raised quite a few men for this war, 44,000 militiamen in particular laid siege at one point to the fortress Louisburg, which we see here in Figure 2 by the painter Peter Monime, who was a contemporary at the time. So at that point, leading up to the French and Indian War, which starts in 1755, in particular at the end of King George's War, so around 1750, we have England is surrounded by the French to the west, and the Spanish to the south. And then in between all of them are the Native Americans trying to maintain their own sovereignty and land. All of them claim the Ohio Valley and the other Western territories. By the 1750s, the British population in the colonies had started to reach about 1 million. And since they were only on the narrow seaboard, they needed somewhere to go, and that they thought would be west, because the French colonies, on the other hand, tended to be very sparsely populated. So in 1755, we see warfare start between the French and their native allies and the British and their native allies. Particularly, we know the British allied with the Iroquois Confederation. The majority of the fighting happened in New York, Pennsylvania, and Canada, and particularly Nova Scotia. So it didn't directly hit Connecticut, but that doesn't mean it didn't have an effect. And at this point in western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, the border was not well defined. These major waterways were used for trading by the French, and so they did have French outposts, but there wasn't a large amount of settlement in that area. Most populations of French settlers lived up in Canada, or what today we call Canada. So in the 1740s, the British, in response to their growing population, started to stretch into this area and move in. The French sent an expedition into the area to find that natives were no longer just loyal to them and had been trading with the British. And by spring of 1754, we see a Lieutenant George Washington sent out into the area to expel the French from the area. And here we have in Figure 3 actually a map drawn by the 22-year-old George Washington of the Ohio River on the 1754 expedition. This ends up ultimately in the Battle of Jumonville Glen, which marks the beginning of open warfare. So in July of 1755, we have the Battle of Monongahela, and this is a horrible defeat for the British, and General Braddock is killed. And initially, the war does not go well for the British. They do manage to capture 2 ships by 1755 in the autumn off the coast of Nova Scotia, which means that the war had gone already in just a year from Pennsylvania all the way north to Canada and Nova Scotia and all the way to the Great Lakes. It wasn't until May 1756, though, that Britain and France finally declared war on each other, although fighting had already been going on for over a year. In 1757, British lose also terribly again at the Fort William Henry on Lake Champlain. They lose it to the French, and it is also the site of a horrible massacre of the surrendering British soldiers. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in a little bit. But then in 1758, William Pitt becomes prime minister, and this turns the war. He is much more gung-ho about winning it, and he starts to devote a lot of time and resources to the war. He orders 20,000 provincial troops from the colonies altogether, and he also promises that the British government will assume the costs incurred to train, equip, arm, and pay these soldiers. So, of course, the colonies jump at the chance to employ their men and send them off to war. And by 1760, it becomes clear that the British will win. Despite this, in 1762, Spain enters the war on the side of the French because of failed peace negotiations between the European leaders. By June 1762, due to this, Britain invaded and took Havana, Cuba, one of their main trading posts and settlements in North America. By February 1763, less than a year later, the Treaty of Paris was signed between the 3 nations, the British, French, and the Spanish, notably leaving out the Native Americans involved. So figure 4 here, we have a picture of the main engagements of the war. It shows again how far it went, all the way from down. The farthest engagements were down in Virginia, and it went all the way up to Nova Scotia in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. What was Ridgefield's involvement in the French and Indian War? Well, Ridgefield's first militia formed in 1727, but in 1748, French and Indian War is mentioned, with town leaders starting to prepare munition stockpiles for impending warfare. It is until 1755, though, that Connecticut is officially called upon to mobilize for war, and 3,000 men enlist, and these include people such as Phineas T. Lyman and Israel Putnam, names that come down to us today, and in ordinary men like Vives Douchy Jr., who famously is said to have enlisted and then died, and then his father enlisted and did not come home, and then his son, also the original Vives, also enlisted, but unfortunately we don't know what happened to them. It doesn't say they died, but at the same time we don't know officially what happened. The Connecticut troops were known to fight in several campaigns. They were in upstate New York in 1755 to 1757 to witness the massacre at Fort William Henry. We know in particular that the Ridgefield men were there and did witness that. This is actually, now if you look at figure 5, this is actually engraving of a French commander who claimed to have been trying to stop the Native Americans from butchering the British soldiers. We're not quite sure how true that is. That's up for some debate, but this is an engraving made later based on that story. And in 1757, we also know that 22 Ridgefield men did enlist under Captain Perez Fitch and Stamford, and these were the ones who went to Fort William Henry. They also might have witnessed multiple other engagements that we know Connecticut soldiers were in, including Fort Louisburg, the Battle of Quebec, and in Havana, Cuba, even. And notably, there's also another Ridgefield resident who was involved in the war with a famous person. In 1758, Reverend Jonathan Ingersoll enlisted to serve as chaplain under the General David Worcester. And as we all know, he would later go on to die during the Battle of Ridgefield in the Revolutionary War. A little bit of a coincidence there. So at the end of the French and Indian War, Canada surrenders in 1760, and it's pretty much over and won for the British, even though the treaty isn't signed until 1763. The North American continent at this point is pretty much British. The French are only left in the Caribbean, really. That's not even shown on this map. It just shows the mainland America in figure 6. But it shows here also that where Spain technically got access to the western territories, but they also got access to southern Florida. And also notably, the Proclamation Line of 1763 was created, which was supposed to define all land east of the Appalachians for the European settlers, and that west of it was called for Indian land and to be left to the Native Americans. This did have multiple impacts on the colonies, including Connecticut. Heavy taxation was one. The creation of an American identity. For the first time, we have American troops and British troops serving separately, and they start to realize differences between the two groups, and they start to create their own identity. And there also starts to be growing colonial dissent due to these taxes and perhaps due to the creation of an American identity. This debt actually causes Britain to be more invested in the colonies and less likely to just give them up and more willing to fight for them because they've seen them as an investment. In Connecticut, there were a few direct impacts of the war. Our two first newspapers were founded, the Connecticut Gazette, of which there is a clipping here pictured, and the Weekly Advertiser, and these were to publish things about the war. And overall, it's estimated that about 12 to 20% of its men were sent to fight, which would be about 16,000 to 20,000 soldiers at the time. We know that at least 1,400 of them died in battle or from disease or other causes during the war years. It also left the colony, just as the British Empire, massively in debt. And this would also have a direct impact on the Revolutionary War, because these debts caused heavy taxation in the form of the Stamp Act and others that we know that led to the American Revolution. So what happened to the American Indians after the French and Indian War? Well, the natives were completely left out of treaty negotiations. And in addition, with the French gone, the natives no longer were able to use them to check the powers of the British Empire. And the British tended to be, compared to the French, far more land hungry. And they actually moved right into French holdings right after and tried to expand their own. And since the natives had fought on both sides, the French and the British, there was increased racism towards them by the British settlers. So all in all, land encroachment continued. The proclamation line does not last, and by May 1763, the Iroquois and the British begin open warfare in what's now called Pontiac's War over control of the land around Fort Pitt, Detroit, and Niagara, or in other words, the land that the French had just ceded. So just months after the proclamation line had been laid out in the treaty, it had already been forgotten. And by 1774, though, there's only 61 natives recorded as being left in Fairfield County. And now, we don't know how accurate this is, but all in all, we can tell there are far less in Fairfield County, and that all of these colonial wars that have been discussed in the past 5 episodes had a large impact on the native populations. Between land encroachment and increasing racism, things were not going well. So that's all for today. If you guys want to know anything else about the French and Indian War, or at least more about it, I've listed a few resources here that you can get an idea, general idea. The French and Indian War is a huge topic, and it's generally considered as part of the 7 Years' War, which is the European theater of it. So this is a really big topic. The book should be available at most libraries, and these 4 websites are also really good at give you a good general idea. Here we also have my references, and quite a few of them are publicly available, and the others should be available if you have access to most regular scholarly databases. Thanks for listening, guys. Have a good one.